Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to our Kelechian Museum. My name is Maggie Mengeseri. I'm sorry for the delay, but we're going live stream our lecture series, and we were fine-tuning some of the background information before we could begin. Today's event is collaborated with two organizations, the National Association for Armenian Studies and the Ararat Kelechian Museum, and this is an ongoing process for the last one. Since 2006, both organizations have teamed up from Boston and Los Angeles to work together and have dynamic programs. We do have two of the representatives, Rupen Berberian as well as Dr. Kelechian, who are present here, who are the co-chairs of the NASA organization from Los Angeles. Today's event is a good friend of the museum. It's Missak Kelechian. He personally is Maurice Missak Kelechian. He's an electrical engineer by training and independent researcher, known for his research and discoveries of Armenian historical documents, photos, monuments, and heritage sites. Currently, he resides in Los Angeles and works in the biomedical field. On a personal note, I've known Missak for the last 8 years. It took me 2 years to find him. Calling him in Lebanon and many places, I was initially trying to get him to talk about the Antelias orphanage, and finally we met and we teamed up together. He's been an excellent mentor to me, and my hat goes out to him. And thank you for all the assistance that it provided me for the last 10 years. Anytime I need assistance, Missak is there for me to help me out. If I need a speaker, I need information, I need documentation, Missak is available. I also want to remind you before I invite him that we do have several events coming up. The next one is on April the 1st, Saturday, because there's an event at the CSUN University Armenian Studies Department. They requested we change our date from Sunday to Saturday. So it's April the 1st at 5 o'clock, and our speaker is Kelechian. And I forgot the book downstairs to show you the volume book that he has published. It's about 560 pages. This is the masterpiece of Herai, of Khachkars. It tells you what the Armenian history is. So for those of you who can make it for the event, it's on April the 1st, Saturday at 5 o'clock. And then we'll take a month break. The following event will be on May 7th and will be by Dr. Abraham Terian on St. Gregory of Merrick, and that will be May 7th, Sunday. And on May 27th will be, a talk will be about Armenians in the Levant, and that will complete our lecture series for this quarter, and then we'll resume again in September. With no further ado, Missak, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Welcome. Antelias. I use Antilias because that was how it was named initially. My both maternal and paternal parents are from Sis. I've never been to Sis, which today is Kozan, but my grandfather wrote the 800-page book about Sis, my paternal grandfather, and from my maternal side, my grandfather's brother was Khach Sarpazan Achabahian. If you don't know your history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know it is part of a tree. Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, where Sis was the capital. As you see it right here. It's right on the Mediterranean, across Cyprus. This was the Kingdom of Cilicia. Catholicosate of Great House of Cilicia was first established in Davlur in 1062, then in Zamandal in 1072, then it moved to Zovk in 1116, then in Rumgla 1149, and finally in Sis in 1293, the capital of the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, modern-day city Kozan in Adana province, Turkey. The city of Sis was the center of the Catholicosate of Cilicia for more than 6 centuries. The monastery of St. Sophia dominated the town, as you can see it right here. A delegation representing the Catholicosate of Great House of Cilicia held a requiem service at the site of the historic Sis Catholicosate on August 22, 2015. Armenian newspapers were very pompous. Harir dari ans Sisi Gatogosaranen Henchets Bahanchadiragan Tsain Medidan Giligyo Gatogosutyan. And the Turkish response, as usual, the only remaining parts of the Catholicosate are these 2 ruins that converted the location into a playground. According to the Catholicosate, this was the first time in 100 years that a pontifical message was delivered from the site of the Catholicosate on August 2015. I fail to understand, what did Aram Vehapar wanted to convey here? It is supposed to be a PR. We're supposed to broadcast and convey our message on a larger scale, not between walls. Where is the CNN? Where is BBC? At least open-minded Turk journalists should have been there at least. Ramification of Cilicia's Catholicosate lawsuit against Turkey, an article written by Harut Sunyan, who is among us today. Despite the noble objectives pursued by the Catholicosate lawsuit, a controversy surfaced in the Armenian community last week when several websites and newspapers reported that the Catholicosate of Cilicia has demanded that the Turkish government either return the property of the Catholicosate of Sis or pay a compensation of 100 million Turkish liras, the equivalent of $37 million. Today, only 2 years later from the lawsuit, 100 million Turkish liras are worth only $26.8 million. We've already lost 10 million. Garo Armenian, a prominent Armenian community leader, wrote a cautionary article titled, "Our sacred sites are not personal possessions." The same year, in 2015, a 125-year-old oil canvas by Paul Gauguin was sold for $300 million. It's just 40 inches by 30 inches for $300 million. Do they know what heritage values we really lost? How ironic. The Catholicosate throne, the seat, an antique made of marble and decorated with carvings, was smashed to bits by Turkish schoolboys at the urging of their fanatical teachers, even though this is known as the throne of King Levon I of Cilicia. Do you agree with me that the throne alone, over 810 years old, is worth more than $37 million or 100 million Turkish liras? During Ali Pasha's visit to the Armenian school in Sis, the Catholicos then asked a 10-year-old seminary student to open a random Bible page for the Pasha as a gesture of luck. And the page, when they opened, is from the book of Isaiah. Awake, awake, Zion, clothe yourself with strength, put on your garments of splendor. Kirikor Catholicos Gesaratsi interprets the specific page to Ali Pasha that he is to become the Grand Vizier, and because of him, the Sis monastery will be rebuilt. The Pasha agrees to keep his promise once he becomes the Grand Vizier. Not long after, Hekimoglu Ali Pasha becomes Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, 3 times he became Grand Vizier. The 10-year-old kid who opened the Bible page, who became clergyman Husik Achabahian, travels in 1731 to Constantinople to remind the Grand Vizier about his promise. In return, Husik receives a decree, a firman, from the Ottoman Sultan granting the Achabayans the right to administer the Catholicosate of Sis. Plus, the Vizier donates all the adjacent lands to the monastery, granting permission to rebuild it. Only a few months back, the Turkish Constitutional Court denied the request of the Catholicosate as no deed was presented, or one of the reasons that there was no deed. We should do our homework much better to bring up that firman from the 1700s. And in December 2016, the Armenian Catholicosate of Cilicia officially filed to reclaim the historical headquarters of the Holy See of Sis from Turkey to the European Court of Human Rights. Do you think if there was no firman or a decree, Armenians will be able to have like a castle around the walls where the Catholicosate or St. Sophia was, and all these compounds to have walled if they didn't have a firman? Who are the Achabahians? The one on the right is my grandfather, and the one on the left is Khatsurtazan Achabahian. This is in Antelias. His last years, I was 8 years old then. And here, this here is baptizing me, and this is when I didn't have my haircut there. The Achabayans are lineage of Cilician princes, heritable guardians of relics since the 13th century. The right hand arm of Saint Gregorius the Illuminator, Sub Grigoris Avorici Ace, and Saint Nicolaus, Saint Sylvester, the Roman Pope, and Saint Bar Soma. These are all right arms that are the most valuable items of the Cilician Cis Catholicosate today. That's why Ace, right arm, Baho, Achabahian. My mother was Achabahian. And after in 1731, Husik Kahana Achabahian's son, Bishop Hovannes becomes first Achabahian Catholicos in Sis. Every family will be proud if they had one Catholicos. The Achabayans had 10. Not 1, not 2, not 3, 10 of them. This is my grandfather, Missak Kelechian, who I carry his name. Almash, he's a graduate of renowned Almash Seminary, states in his book, this book, The Greatness of St. Sophia. Now I'm going to show you the picture. It is a black and white picture of that day, obviously. The technology was not there. This is the throne of Sis. But when you look at this picture, you don't understand it completely because black and white, it doesn't show how rich it was. I'm going to show you a sample of a Kayseri church today, again, Sud Grikorlu Savorit church today, with gold and golden covered at least. And I'm going to read to you from my grandfather's book. The altar that you see in the background, it's going to become significant because there's light coming from the back and is showing. St. Sophia was built by Catholicos I Achabahian. The magnificent high altar at the inner sanctum of the cathedral, elaborately sculpted and entirely covered in gold. Now you think this is a small place. Look at the sargavaks here, their height. Look how huge is the place. Elaborately sculpted and entirely covered in gold, the main altar was a masterpiece of Armenian art. It was 3 meters wide and had 12 gradients or tiers. Surp Khorani, I say tiers astijaner, I think in Parsutyuna, the height was 12 tiers. It rested on 4 finely carved high pillars, which created a very large, eye-catching ciborium. This is the ciborium. It covered, if you think of it like 3D, it covered on top of the altar, crowned by the Armenian eagle. The 2 side canopies, which led to the back side of the main altar, created 2 smaller ciborias as you see them here. The Catholicosate throne, known as the throne of King Levon I of Cilicia. The throne was unique in its kind on a double-tiered pedestal rose 4 monolithic marble columns which carried a baldaquin in the form of a sanctuary dome resting on 12 arches housing images of the 12 apostles. On the 2 sides of the throne, there were 2 flagstones carved of a single piece of marble. At their extremities, there were the symbols of the 4 evangelists in the form of the 4 symbolic animals. This is what we lost. In 1915, St. Sophia becomes a mosque. I'm going to leave this picture and I'm going to read the details that my Sirpazan Ammo or Khat Sirpazan Achabayan has written. In Turk, a Turk called Göy Fakih sends a petition to the governor requesting to bring down the altar as it's blocking sunlight from the back windows. You see these sunlight windows, their reason to topple the altar was because of sunlight, blocking sunlight from the back windows. The petition is approved by the governor. A group of Turkish villagers are authorized to knock down the altar. The eye-catching ciborium over the altar, which was covered in gold, is pulled down by ropes. After the armistice between 1918 and 1921, when some Armenians returned to Sis and Cilicia under the French mandate, Archbishop Yerishe Garoyan sued Göy Fakih, that Turkish guy, since he knew him personally, for the vandalism of Sofia for 50,000 Ottoman gold. But Göy Fakih, smart enough, he showed the authorization letter from the governor that allowed him to pull it down because of light not coming down, and the French mandate judges were obligated to release him because he had a letter from the governor authorizing him. However, a Turkish book on history of Sis mentions that a court punitive damage amount for vandalizing the throne was set to 1 million Turkish gold pounds at that time in 1921. But unfortunately, time was running against the Armenians when the French forces withdrew from the occupied zone in 1922. Therefore, the court judgment was not implemented. Then, the Treaty of Ankara in 1921, French mandate in Cilicia is over. French recognizes Kemalist government. Catholicosate depart Cilicia for the last time on November 25, 1921. The Exodus signifies the termination of Catholicosate of Sis after 800 years of existence. The Catholicosate had maintained jurisdiction for over 214 churches and 267 parishes. Why did the Vehapar not claim those two? Why only go after the Sis Catholicosate and not the additional 214 churches? And again, from my grandfather's book, a 1940s picture, and this is St. Sophia. This was where the main altar was, all in ruin, and the only parts which are left now are two sides, as we show that the Turks have turned it into a playground for children. Another information was brought from Meiser Pazanamo was the caravan of the monastery of Sis. The only eyewitness, because he moved all those treasuries all the way from Sis into Aleppo at that time. How the treasures of monastery of Sis were taken to Aleppo in 1915, an eyewitness account by Khat Vartabet Achabahian then. On the 3rd of September, after a meeting with the Turkish governor of Sis, the local tenants of Catholicos Sahak II, Archbishop Yegishe Garoyan, brought the horrific news of expulsion orders. The Brotherhood of the monastery was given 10 days notice to depart Sis for Aleppo, issued from Istanbul. The journey was 23 days long. They started from Sis, then they arrived to the Ceyhun River. They had to cross the river, and I will tell you what happened there. That's why it gets a red star. Then from Ceyhan to Osmaniye, and then from Osmaniye to Hasanbeyli. Then in the Antelias mountains, the cart broke again, the wheels, and they were stuck there. And from there to Islahiye, then to Katma, then to Azaz, and down to Halab. That is in 23 days journey. I'm going to put pictures for you, and I'm going to quickly describe. It's a 4-page. I'm not going to be reading the 4 pages, just briefly, so that you know what happened during that trip, because the most important, valuable relics and the treasury stuff that came from Sis made it to Antelias today is because of this trip. We placed the precious vessels, the priceless liturgical vestments, ancient manuscripts, an important part of the artifacts of the monastery in specially prepared wooden cases and waited for the last instructions. The 13th of September 1915, all the keys of monastery were handed over to the government. We kissed the sacred stones of the Mother Cathedral of Catholicosate of Cilicia, bid a last farewell, and set out our journey of no return. We left to the barbarians the wonderful, crafted, and century-old monastery of Sis. They had barely reached the edge of the city when the cauldron, Mironi Gatsan, of the Holy Chrism, Miron, fell off the cart, and 3 kilograms or 3 liters of the holy oil was spilled, as though anointing the sacred soil of Sis for the last time. On the first day of our torturous route of expulsion, this was a first omen for us, as of that moment we were caught in despair and shuddered at the prospect of imminent death at any minute. In the next morning we continued our journey and arrived at the banks of river Jihan, where thousands of deported Armenians from many parts of Cilicia had gathered, waiting their turn to cross the river on rafts. Perhaps out of respect for our religious status and in order to speed up our passage and spare us days of delay, the police guard showed exceptional assistance. Immediately we began to load the carts on the rafts, but another disaster struck. The steel wires which held the rafts loaded with mule-driven carts. So the mules, the carts, and all the relics and all the everything, vestments are on the carts with mules on the raft. The boxes filled with most valuable vessels of the monastery snapped. The strong currents pushed the raft away from the shore, and the carts fell into the river and began to sink. A group of young men among the deportees from Hajan and Vahga jumped into the river, unafraid of the perils, and dived into the 4 or 5 meters deep water. They first broke open the planks that held the boxes, then one by one rescued them, including the case, as you see it here, that contains the reliquants, the right hand of Srpski Nicola Savoric, the relics of Bishop St. Nicolaus, the miracle worker, and the right arm of Pope St. Sylvester. This was a silver-plated and finely engraved case, ornaments by images of ancient patriarchs, as you can see. We left Hasan Beyli for Islahiye very early in the next morning. The route was very hard and tiresome. In the evening, we barely reached to Antelias Hill. The next day, just when our ox-driven carts loaded with wooden cases began to move downhill, 2 wheels broke off and we were grounded on that spot until the next day. As the darkness fell onto the wilderness, we were gripped by fear when passers-by told us few days earlier of dozens of Armenians were slaughtered in the same place where we were standing. The somber news terrified us, and we were at the total loss about what to do because of the broken wheel and the slaughterhouse in Antelias. After long deliberation, we decided that one of us would stay with the driver and cart, the other would continue to Iran Valley in order to find out new carts. Now imagine my Serpazanamo with all these gold and silver and relics and all this wealth stuck in Antelias on the hills, knowing that couple of dozens Armenians were slaughtered the previous day. He had to stay there. Just imagine what he was going through. Until suddenly they heard the next day that nobody was coming, and until the next day night somebody showed up. 2 Circassian drivers stood on the side of the road shouting my name. Rahib Khat, Rahib Khat. Rahib in Turkish, it's like monk Khat or reverend Khat. I was relieved and encouraged. As soon as he gave me the note, we knew that was Vartabet Margarian who was with him, who went to get new carts. These carts were the replacement. I felt as I was reassured, like Lazarus rising from death, I was revived. We loaded our cases onto the new carts and set off before midnight at dawn and arrived safely to Iran. And eventually, our journey from Sis to Aleppo lasted 23 days. Despite many misshapes on our way, the catastrophe and the assaults, by divine assistance, we brought the treasures of the monastery to Aleppo with no losses or damage and submitted them to His Holiness the Catholicosate Second, Khabayan. Turkish doctrine we knew. Back in January, Talat was very clear. There is room only for Turks in Turkey. That immediately identified Assyrians, Jews, Arabs, and Armenians, that they are not welcome there. One of the most important telegrams sent by Ambassador Henry Morgenthau to U.S. Secretary of State, where he said, the destruction of Armenian race in Turkey is progressing rapidly. Massacres reported at Angora and Bursa. Here's the important part. Will you suggest to Cleveland Dodge, Charles Crane, John Mott, Rabbi Stephen Wise, and others to form a committee to raise funds and provide means to save some of the remaining Armenians? This call was responded after 2 weeks only. Americans to the rescue, where Department of State under the leadership of James Barton and Cleveland Dodge founded American Committee for Armenian and Syrian Relief in 1915. In 1918, the committee was renamed into American Committee for Relief in the Near East. In 1919, it was incorporated by U.S. Congress. The committee's name for Near East Relief. This is the map of Turkey. Black Sea, Turkey. Every star that you see was an orphanage, a hospital, collecting orphans, separated women, including all the way into Armenia and down to Mesopotamia, as well as into Greece. But after the armistice, meaning after the war, when Turkey lost the war and the British and the French forces landed there in 1921, 22, and early 23, when Kemalist Turkey started taking over, they strictly forbid that they could not help any Christians, or they can't guarantee the lives of any Christians in Turkey itself in gray here. So Near East Relief was obligated to move all those orphanages and the children there to Greece and Bulgaria on the east, on the west, and on the east into Batum, Alexandropol, and Ararat and Yerevan, as well as Tabriz and Urmia, and to the south to Lebanon, Syria, and Jerusalem. Always my research starts with a photo. Something triggers when I look at photos. June 2005, while visiting Antelias archives and looking into Maria Jacobson's folder, I came across a photo of a house that had a large Australian flag with hundreds of children. The photo had no caption. I had no idea where that was. I was curious of why an Australian flag was on top of a typical Lebanese house. In 2006, Harut Sasunyan forwarded me an email from Vikem Babkenyan, a researcher from Australia who spoke from here a few months back about his book. It started all in a photo, and he was looking in the archival material on an Australasian orphanage located in Antelias, Lebanon. There came my answer to my photo. Here it is. An Australian flag hanging from an orphanage. We identified where it was. And researchers start with Vikem Babkenyan, who wrote the book about Antelias and the orphanage, that it was run by the Australians. In 1922-23, NER evacuated 22,000 children from orphanages in Turkey and transported them to Greece, Syria, and Lebanon. Jakob Kunzer, a Swiss national, who worked for the NER, led 5,000 orphans. This picture that you see, this is part of the 5,000 orphans that they walked all the way, a 513-mile trip, walking to get out of Turkey. And here it is, in the New York Times. New orphanage at Beirut, opened under the auspices of Near East Relief. An alliance between the United States and Australasia for relief work was signalized by opening today of an Australasian orphanage for 1,200 Armenian refugees. Antelias orphanage that became the headquarters of the Armenian Catholicosate of Great Halt of Cilicia. There was the orphanage then, and this is the Catholicosate today. This is an aerial photo where you see the compound here, where my laser pointer is, and this is the church and different buildings in Antelias. As they reached the Australasian orphanage at Antelias, this is how they looked. Even adult women, these are the way they arrived as refugees. The first arrivals at Antelias. This is the seaside shore. It looks over the Mediterranean. This is the door. This is when they arrive. As you can see, some of them have no shoes as they arrived. Others arrived by Near East Relief trains, others with trucks. But this is how they were treated. Reverend Creswell from Adelaide Congregational Church, now Uniting Church, where my friend Vikem Babkenyan spoke and introduced their history as well. And Armenian Relief Fund of Australia, this is Mrs. Gordon. Basically, it reads, after bathing them, they were giving new clothes. These are posters where Armenian Relief Fund in Australasia was raising funds to fund the orphanage in Antelias. This is Nellie Miller, her son lives in Arizona, that I've talked to him many, many times, who shared his mom's photos, valuable photos of Antelias. They became their own builders. Not that they didn't have any houses to live, but they built their own houses. Orphan boys evacuated from Anatolia laid the foundations for their new home at Antelias, Syria. They lived temporarily under tents like this until their dormitories were built. But nobody to build them. They had to build them themselves. Here you see the picture of the tents and blankets where they slept, and during the day they worked to build their own dormitories. Putting the finishing touch on the new dormitories, every nail was driven by the boys themselves. Inside the dormitories, which later became the first church of the Armenian Catholicosate, called Surtak Manchats. The dormitory became the church, and here's the Quran. Obviously, the kids were happy that somebody was looking after them. Here are orphans who are saluting the Australian flag. And here about 1,400 of them getting ready for lunch or supper. This is how they did. There were no tables. They will lay the plates on the floor. They will pray, and then they will sit and eat. It's a very unique, colorful picture, as you saw. This is how it was. At that time, they used to use hand painting to make color slide lantern picture, and this is a unique one. But this was not easy. All the way from Australia, they had to raise funds to keep the Antelias orphanage. Can you imagine any Armenians flying 8,825 miles away to look after some orphanages? This is what the Australians did. They flew, or by ship they came 8,825 miles away to Antelias to support these kids. Look at this. The first Armenian relief shipment from Melbourne, and the sign reads, Australian flour for starving Armenian children. And where did these bags go? They obviously were on a ship, and they arrived into Antelias so that the orphans will unload them themselves from the trucks. Protection of under the protection of Australian flag, under the watchful eyes of Reverend James Creswell, Miss Gordon, and Mr. Knudsen from New Zealand, because it was Australasian, so it was New Zealand and Australia supporting it. This is Mrs. Knudsen, who's pregnant here, and she had a son, actually had twin. And George Arjayan, who is from the Boston, Massachusetts area, his grandmother was looking after that baby. I provided that picture to him only a few days ago. This is a more postcard picture when the Catholicosate just before it belonged to the Catholicosate. This is how the orphanage looked. Orphelinat Américain, Antelias. Let me give you some background. The background that you see here, it's actually blue. It's the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. But because the picture is against light, you can't make out of it. Here is the Catholicosate of Antelias today. Do you see this river that flows all the way into the Mediterranean Sea? Here it is. I had to climb on high buildings so I can take a picture of these, because Armenian orphan girls were doing laundry in that river at that time. March 29, 1925 was a historical day for Antelias orphanage. Why? Because it was visited by His Holiness Sahak II Khabayan and myself as an Ammu. They had a mission. They moved from Aleppo to Beirut, and then from Beirut to Zahle, and from Zahle back to Aleppo. They didn't have an institution. They were for several years going from one place as guests in monasteries. But that day they came at the request of the Antelias orphanage director, because there were orphans which were not baptized, and they wanted to give the honor for the Catholicos himself to baptize them. So there wasn't a church at that time, so they built an open altar covered with cedar and palm branches, and 43 orphans were baptized in Antelias river on that day. The orphanage, they won the first prize in furniture making because they were taught carpentry. They won the first prize in the Syrian National Exhibition. They called them Syrian here at that time. Lebanon did not exist, and it was called Greater Syria. That's why it's under that. But these carpenters were so good by making furniture, they also made wooden tricycles for the smaller orphans down in the south, in Sidon, in the Bird's Nest. Bird's Nest today is in Jebel, which is in north, in Byblos. But the original Bird's Nest orphanage was in Sidon, where these pictures are. And these tricycles are handmade by the Antelias orphans. How wonderful passing love that was given to the Antelias children to the Sidon orphans as well. Teaching Armenian on the sands or on the Mediterranean. The hospice, where children would, when they get sick, they would be after, and you can see the Australian flag. And this seaside entrance is very important because I'm going to be showing something later on. Remember, this looked to the sea, the entrance, and was guarded by the scouts. More and more orphans were arriving. More funds were needed to support them. So much that Near East Relief, in the Los Angeles Times in 1925, they had this picture showing 500 boys lined up in a way as like an empty bowl, meaning our food is running out. Raise funds so we can continue eating. I was sad in seeing this bad picture, or not bad picture, I meant low resolution picture in the newspaper. And I looked and I looked and I looked, and in UCLA I found the original picture. Look at it. 500 boys standing in such a way to reflect that their food is running out and asking for help, symbolizing the need for further help. Of course, they were playing as well. They had to have playgrounds, have scouts, have sports, different orphanages, because there were 7 or 8 orphanages in Lebanon, and they were coming and doing sports competition between them to keep their spirits high, to get rid of their traumas and their sad stories of their parents. They even had a band. Look at the music band in the back, where the sign here reads, Near East Relief Antelias Trade School Band 1926 banner. It was in 1929, Catholicosate Second Chabayan of Holy See of Cilicia officially asked Near East Relief to transform the Antelias orphanage into a theological seminary and training school for teachers, because we ran out of teachers. Either they were killed and all over the country. A special Antelias committee was put together in New York to investigate the feasibility of transferring the Antelias orphanage to the Catholicosate. And the Near East Relief would grant use of Antelias property to the Armenian Church for 5 years at a symbolic $1 per year. That's a good price. But on top of it, they will allocate for 5 years $10,000 per year for 5 years trial period towards the school annual budget of $15,000, with the understanding that the Armenian Church would assume all the costs at the end of that time. Armenians in America agreed to raise remaining $5,000 per year to support the $15,000 budget yearly, and that $5,000 was given by the AGBU, the Karagosian, and the Gulbenkian Foundation to support that $5,000 gap. And the Antelias Committee diligently was following, and these are the actual numbers and budget figure and expenses over the years. As I said, the orphan barrack becomes the first church of the Armenian Catholicosate of Great House of Cilicia. But in 1934, when time was running, during their annual meeting, the NER Board of Trustees voted to sell the property to the Near East Foundation for $22,000. The property was sold to the Armenian Church for $19,000. The sum was donated by an Egyptian Armenian couple, Mr. and Mrs. Simon and Matilde Kelechian. The Near East Foundation itself contributed $3,000 towards that purchase price as well. And it was this way that the orphanage, the Near East Relief Orphanage, became the Catholicosate of Great House of Cilicia. This is how the entrance was, and you can read Gatolgo Saran Hayot Mezedan Giligyo in Armenian here, and this is how it looks today. But during that sale, during my research, I found out that there is a plot, 2,300 square feet, that still belongs to Near East Relief today. And these are the Lebanese Registry of Deeds, that part is still registered under Near East Relief name and under Joseph Forrest Crawford, who was at that time an AOB professor, and he was looking after Antelias. And this Registry of Deeds, I found it, I researched it, I think it was in 2012 or 13 something. In order to collect money and funds to buy the Catholicosate, obviously they had to have some marketing material, so they printed out this little booklet which showed what it had. And here it is. Award by the Lebanese Republic. That's the Lebanese president here in 1933, I'm sorry, this is in the New York Times. And it reads, has conferred upon Sahak II Catholicos of Armenian Church in Syria and head of the Near East Foundation School at Antelias its Order of Merit. The foundation announced yesterday President Charles the Best of Lebanese Republic presented the award and recent visit to and here's His Holiness Sahak Habayan, and here's my Sirpazan Amo Khat Sirpazan Achabayan. But something very interesting happened here that very few people know. I'm going to take you all the way to the United States. Arlington National Cemetery is the United States military cemetery in Arlington County in Virginia, across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. It's the most respected site where any military person would be honored to be buried. But did you know that 12 cedar trees from Lebanon, which were blessed by Antelias Sahak II Habayan, were sent to Arlington? Here it is. Franklin Roosevelt's, FDR's wife, Mrs. Roosevelt, and this is from the Washington Post in 1934, takes to the radio today in accepting on behalf of the President 12 cedars of Lebanon sent by the Americans in the Near East for planting in the Arlington Cemetery. The cedars, before leaving Syria, received the blessing of Sahak II, the Catholicos of the Armenian Church in Syria, and the felicitation of the student and so forth. This is really an honor that should be remembered in the United States and dug up and shown those cedar trees in the Arlington Cemetery and be honored every year so that we can get ownership. And here's a picture where the First Lady, FDR's First Lady, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, here with some Lebanese folks receiving those trees in Arlington Cemetery. But for me to have the connection, I have to find survivors. I wanted to find someone from Antelias Orphanage. And in 2008, I was able to find a very known figure, Suren Antoyan, in 2008. He was an orphan in Antelias Orphanage. He is a very well-known Tashnak Sagan active person, or was in Lebanon. And working with Viken from Australia, we had a team of photographers and radio broadcasts fly all the way from Australia, come to interview Baron Suren Antoyan about his life at the orphanage. Can you imagine? The Australians didn't know. We Armenians, the Antelias seminary folks, didn't know that it was owned by or run by the Australians. So Australian took it that, and unfortunately before the program was broadcasted, he passed away, and only his desk was left. But fortunately his daughter was kind enough to publish memoir of her father in a book. And Okay. It's not letting me. And one more thing happened is that I was able to find another survivor called Paylak Titoyan. Me and my lovely wife, Anita, we drove 4 hours, 2 hours each way, and spent about 4 to 5 hours with Paylak Titoyan to register his voice and his stories. I'm not able to. All right, just give me a second to run the video. It's not cooperating with me. Just a second here. Oh, it's there. Got it. And I found out he was one of those 43 orphans which was baptized in that river. I'm sorry. One more time. Bravo, Alec. It was a wonderful interview. He thought I was an orphan from his age because he was, with my estimate, he was at least 106 or 107 because his card of registry said 1915, and he couldn't have been in Antelias then, so he should have been 106 and 107. His memory was impeccable, but in chunks. The older I got, took him back, the more he remembered. And I kept on repeating, and he thought that he says, how do you remember? Yes, we used to jump from that wall and that wall. It was a beautiful interview. I have roughly about 3 to 4 hours continuously talking to him. It was great, and unfortunately last year he passed away, but I'm glad I was able to capture his memory as one of the 43 orphans who was baptized in that church, in that river I meant. Just to give you an idea, the Cilician diocese historically consisted of plain of Cilicia, which is here, the blue one, and the mountainous or rugged Cilicia, plain is right here, the darker blue, and the lighter blue is here, and the Antitaurus diocese is here, and as well as the Perio or Aleppo diocese, which included Antep and Kilis, and as well as Cyprus. That is what is known. But after the mandate, Alexandretta and Antioch as well, as a result, would happen. So as a result of the genocide, the Catholicosate lost the first 3. So the majority of its dioceses were lost, obviously. Was only left with Peria, Aleppo, and then Cyprus as well. As a result of the Catholicosate lost the first 3 dioceses, and of Aleppo lost later on Antep and Kilis because they became part of Turkey. So Aleppo is in Syria. And the 2 new dioceses were Alexandria and Antioch, which are right here. Which eventually in 1939, the Sanjak of Alexandria was handed over to Turkey by the French, and today is called Hatay in Turkey. Catholicosate II departed from Cilicia for the last time on November 25, 1921. From 1921 to 1930, the Holy Cilician See was transferred from Aleppo to Beirut, to Damascus, to Zahle, and back to Aleppo. For several years, the See took residence as a guest in monasteries, in houses, and rented apartments, before finally finding stable home in Beirut, but without its own institutional base. Catholicos of all Armenians, Kevort V, Surenian of Echmiadzin, encouraged new jurisdictions for the Cilician See. After lengthy negotiations between the Catholicosate of Cilicia and the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, which owned the diocese, in 1929, Patriarch Yerishe Turian and the congregation agreed to temporarily transfer the jurisdiction, dioceses of Lebanon, Damascus, Latakia, parishes of Hama, Homs, as well as Cyprus, to the Cilician See. Here we see launching of AGBU Armenian Youth Association in 1937 with Catholicos II of Chabayan. Here we see 1950 an aerial picture of the Antelias Catholicosate near the Mediterranean Sea, and this one is in the 50s where with a color picture. This is then over here, and this is now, and these two buildings, high-rise buildings, are either being built or on their way to be built. I wanted to finish my presentation in a very unique footage that I was able to research and find. See, this is the seaside door that I was talking about, the entrance. Same entrance door here. This picture is taken from the seaside. Again, the door which was guarded from the inside this time. Because this is the arrival of the first 350 orphans to Antelias in 1922. Take a look at this. See the entrance? Thank you very much for your attention.
Any questions?
Because that footage I don't have the rights to broadcast, and I'm doing, this is for education, it's not non-profit, so just to make sure nobody goes around and sues me for using that.
I'm surprised about the Australasian involvement in this case. I thought that the Nearest Relief Fund and the Danish missionaries were first involved. How did this resonate so well in Australia and New Zealand that they started first about establishing an orphanage in Lebanon?
Well, the speaker, he's a later orphan from Bird's Nest, and I'm honored that he's asking me the first question. He is from Bird's Nest, yes. Near East Relief had an international director who flew around to tell why Near East Relief is collecting money or funds for. And this director, he flied to the east. He visited China, Japan, Rangoon, Malaysia, Korea, as well as Australia. And there was a response from them. So Near East Relief in Geneva, they met and they had to come up with an international branch of Near East Relief so that other countries can also have help. And it's not, because Near East Relief was a U.S. Congress incorporated figure, and it had to had an international branch, and that's how the Australasian got involved. And Reverend Creswell was from Australia in Melbourne, and as well as the Major Knudsen was from New Zealand. So they formed the Australasian part of Near East Relief, and it was separate entities, so that Antelias, the Catholicosate area before it became, was taken care of the Australians and the New Zealanders. So they owned it. When you say in the case of Denmark, when Maria Jacobsen, she was in Harpert, she was working for the Near East Relief. And in Sidon as well, she was working for Near East Relief. Eventually, whatever she learned from the Americans or the way, then the Danish, the government and the churches in Danish, they came to own also Bird's Nest in Jubail today. They bought it from the Americans because it used to be an American orphanage before. And Nichols Hall, that you probably spent so much time there in your really childhood, was built again by Armenian orphans. I have pictures with kids with hammers on top of Nicol Hall, hammering, and unfortunately that Nicol Hall today is becoming a restaurant. Yes. I got to hear from Mike.
Came in 1922 to Antelias orphanage place, right?
The first time the orphanage was opened was in 1922, as I showed you in the New York Times article.
Where were these kids before, this orphanage kids?
These kids were in Turkey. When Turkey lost the war, as I showed you the map with red stars, those were all over Turkey. Over 22,000 orphans the Near East Relief had to bring over to safer areas, Syria, Lebanon, Armenia, and as well as to Greece. And part of them were the ones who arrived to Antelias.
Thank you.
Yes. Can you give the microphone?
Very eye-opening, honestly. Thank you. Question. This is a part of truth of what happened at that part of land in the earth in that years. And the United States really had shown his kindness, morality, Near East Relief. Question. There is a place over there where an American military base is placed. That's Incirlik.
Yes.
And my question is this. By having this story, how we can close that airport, which is built basically over the Armenian bones, killing fields. It is very contradictory what the United States did at that time. I think that airport must be closed. After seeing your report, listening to you, I think we have to start a movement.
We are already late to start that.
No.
We should have, excuse me, we should have started long time ago. We should have reached a point much going forward. And the other thing is, we have to be united. If you're not united, I do not believe in emotional feelings. I can make you cry while you speak here, telling you good things, but in political areas, work is needed. Union is needed. Funds are needed. And that does not exist in our community, I'm sorry.
I will a little bit go against you. United, you can do it. By putting a goal, you can be united.
Yeah, the one in front.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. And I was curious, you mentioned that the church took over the orphanage.
Yeah, they bought it.
What happened? I'm curious to what happened to the orphans, orphans?
Oh, in the initial years, the orphans stayed there because Near East Relief became 1930 Near East Foundation. And from 1915 to 1930, they were looking after the orphans. The orphans grew up, and the orphans, as soon as they became 16, boys or girls, they were required to leave because there were so many orphans. So from 1915 to 1930, Near East Relief was shutting down their operations. They couldn't continue funding these orphans forever. So that's why the Catholicos at that time asked to change the orphanage into a seminary or a theological center so they can start building new teachers and classes and all that. So some of the orphans became students in the seminary as well. And eventually they found work, they had to go out and stuff. They were not kids, remember, one is 1915, from 1922 all the way to 1930, they grew up and they became more than 16-year-old. And some orphanages continued, like Bird's Nest, continued all the way to 1970s until it was given to the Catholicosate as well. So it's a transitional period that has happened. Yes. Right here. You can sit down. That's okay.
Excuse me, Dr. Simonian. İlgi hasretine para gezegeler. The temporary transfer of the churches of the Syrian and Lebanese, that's something quite interesting. It emphasizes temporary in the documents all the time, but again, I will take it as a blessing in disguise, because it became not only a flourished Catholicosate, but also they went overboard. As we all know, since 1956, they not only forgot about the temporary status, but they reclaimed other dioceses as well. Now, the word temporary was emphasized at that time simply because the Jerusalem Brotherhood was not in favor of giving anything to anybody, rightfully so. But apparently, the help of the Catholicos, Kevor Kinkerort, made the difference, and the term temporary helped a great deal. But unfortunately, as I said, it became a blessing. I am one of the students and the graduates of Antelias, and my superior was Hatzer Pazan, definitely, in those years. He ordained me, not priest, but he gave me the 4 degrees of Vartaverutyun in Holy Eshmeyazin. So I am in it. But the temporary situation was only I wouldn't say this, but I must say it's a joke. It turned to be a blessing, fortunately.
Yes, it turned out to be a blessing because at the same time in around 1949, when Palestine became Israel and the Arabs didn't speak with the Israelis and stuff, so all the dioceses in the Arab world, like Lebanon, Syria and stuff, were also disconnected from Jerusalem as well. And yes, in the papers, in the documents, it says temporary, but the real life, as we all know, what has happened after that.
Thank you, Mr. Kelechian. You've been a very knowledgeable contributor about our past and shared it with us so beautifully today. I'm sure at times you've also, as a futurist, looked into the future for our Armenian presence both in the homeland of Armenia, Artsakh, and the diaspora. Do you have any ideas to share with us about the future?
That's a very hard question to ask, and no, I don't. But looking in past activities and how we process or how we get things to do, we have more weight than we can handle. We are emotionally excellent responsiveness, excellent emotional words and things, but unfortunately the world does not work that way. Emotions and rights, paper rights, it's not me. Kharimian Hari said, Tukhte Sharab. We don't represent a number. We're too small and unorganized. Very unorganized. We can't have 3 people saying the same thing. I'm being nice. It should be 2, but I'm being nice. I'm saying we can't have 3 Armenians agree on one point. But individually, everybody is as big as an emperor in his field, in his business, in his whatever, in his education, in his whatever. But collectively, it is very hard for me to remember the name of a leader in the last 50 years. Maybe Antranik Pasha was the only one that everybody could agree on. Give me a leader's name that everybody can see him or her as a leader. Last one.
I just wanted to thank you for the extensive research you have done. And I was wondering 2 questions. The first question about, do you know any of the kids have any of the kids were able to travel to Australia and to New Zealand?
Yes.
Besides the nearest, relief.
Yes, a lot of times to help the orphans. You got to understand, we Americans look at it as very emotional. Hi, Askatovchi Gorsovi, don't go out. But for the nearest relief employees or volunteers, most of them were volunteers. Very few were employees. For them, the amount of orphans was so much. For them, it's just whoever they could save, and they would encourage either some of the missionaries or some of the visitors, because at that time there were a lot of boats which would visit Greece or Lebanon or Syria and visit to buy handmade products that were done by the orphans, and some of them who didn't have children would by the permission of the orphanages, they took the children back to France, to United States, as well as Australia. I do have 1 or 2 people in Australia that I know, but I can't remember their names.
The second question is, what happened to the relics? Are they still in Lebanon, the church relics?
Yes. The relics that I showed you, the chairs, the box, all the vestments, all the sagir, all those boxes that were moved from Sis by my Serpazanamo all the way to Aleppo, they are all safe and sound, and they are in the museum of Catholicosate of Cilicia in Antelias today. It's either in the museum, and during Miron Ortnek, every couple of years, I believe it's 7 years, those arches are brought up and are used to mix the Miron or showed off in public to be kissed and honored and stuff like that. But what interests me of those 4 arches, one of them is Rome's Pope Sylvester's right arm. I have no idea how I haven't done research for that, But I would have thought that Aram Vehapar would have used that relic either with the Pope, because he had an excellent performance on the 100th anniversary, genocide, the 100th anniversary year in the Vatican, and in English that was extremely impressive, and convey to the world the situation where we are in a very excellent PR, and he should use that relic to show the Vatican or in places like that.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
This concludes. Thank you.